Hey everyone, today on Big Out Books, we're going to be talking about high school required reading. I was inspired to make this video after watching a video on the subject on Olive from abookolive's channel, so I'll link her video down below, but she basically talks about her experience having to read books in high school, what those books were, and what her thoughts and opinions were on those books. Her video made me realize that I've heard a lot of people on BookTube talk about their less than favorable experiences with high school required reading, which kind of strikes me as interesting, since you'd think people in the online bookish community would be the types of students who are like the most engaged about reading books in high school, and yet that's often really not the case. So I kind of wanted to talk about the whole idea of high school required reading, maybe why people aren't drawn to the kind of books that we're often required to read, and I wanted to talk about it from my own perspective as a former high school student and a current high school English teacher. So that's why we're going to be going with this video, and I'm going to start things off by talking about the books that I had to read myself in high school and why I really didn't like most of them. Before we get into the books, I want to have a quick disclaimer that I'm really not attacking these books as being inherently bad or anything, and I'm not trying to criticize any educators who are currently teaching with these books, since I think that if you are a good educator, you can make any text become a vehicle for relevant conversations and discussions. So I'm really not trying to say like these books are terrible and should be banned. I'm just talking about my own experience and why they didn't particularly work for me in high school. So when I was thinking about the reasons why I didn't like the books that I had to read, I came up with three main reasons. The first reason why I didn't love the books I read in high school was I felt that they just weren't challenging enough for me. And this is because I'm someone who had been reading my whole life. I read for pleasure a lot outside of school. So I felt that when I was in that classroom setting, I wanted to be tackling some books that could be challenging and teaching me some new skills about interpretation. So I really wanted to be taking on some big classics, and that's just kind of not really what happened, which is fair, right? I understand that a teacher has to pick a text that is going to work for everyone's strengths and abilities in a classroom. So unfortunately for me, that just left me feeling like the books were a little bit on the more boring side when I was like ready to go and to read some crazy books. My second dissatisfaction with high school reading is that the books we read really weren't diverse enough. So we maybe had like two texts that tackled racism, but they were both written by white authors. So we didn't have any interaction with own voices lit, and I just felt like a lot of the books that we were reading were kind of coming from this same perspective, which is a critique that a lot of people have with the Western canon in general. So I just would have loved to have learned more about life in different parts of the world, maybe read some translated fiction. Another thing was that we didn't read any content by Indigenous authors, but also on the flip side, we didn't read any Canadian authors, period, which I think is a bit strange. So it would have been nice to learn a little bit more about our country's own literary tradition. So it was kind of like this lose-lose situation where I felt like the books weren't diverse enough and I wasn't learning about other parts of the world, and yet at the same time, we weren't reading anything that was specifically Canadian either, so I wasn't seeing my own experience reflected in these books. So that's kind of something that I didn't love. My third reason is a little bit looser and more difficult to define, but I felt like the texts that we were reading just weren't relevant, and that I felt like I wasn't able to form many personal connections with the texts that I was reading. They just didn't connect with my own experiences as a teenager, or they didn't really give me enough of a new perspective to give me like a deeper understanding of the world. So again, that's kind of like broad and difficult to define, but I just didn't feel like the relevance was there with these books. Now, the major exception to this list was the Shakespeare that I had to read in school, which I absolutely loved. I, like many of us, had to read a Shakespeare play each year of high school, and it was something that I always looked forward to. I found Shakespeare challenging and really engaging to analyze and quite relevant to the world around me. So teaching Shakespearean plays in high school is a bit of a charged subject, and there are people who feel quite passionately from both sides. I'm obviously really biased. I'm someone who just loves Shakespeare. I read it on my own all the time for fun, so it's hard for me to not see the value in his works, but also I understand on the other side of the issue that Shakespeare is just really difficult, and especially as schools now are having more students that are coming from an English as a second language background, Shakespeare can be a real barrier for success. So I am really wondering whether it's something that we need to hold on to for 4 years of high school when it could be holding some of our students back or keeping them from being as successful as they'd like to be in an English course. Moving along from Shakespeare, and now we're going to get into the novels that I had to read. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be telling you each of the novels that I read each year, reasons why I didn't really love them, and in order to be a bit more positive in this video, I'm going to talk about some recommendations or some books that I would love to teach in their place. Starting off with grade 9, the first novel that I had to read in high school was the much beloved American classic To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, which I absolutely did not care for and still don't to this day, although perhaps I'm being a little bit hard on it and maybe I should reassess it since my tastes as a reader have quite changed a lot since I was 14 years old. Now, I understand that this book deals with some weighty themes and can teach you a lot of lessons about judgment and racism in the American South, but for me as a 14-year-old, this book was just way too childish, and now this might not be your experience. But when I was 14, I did not want to look back nostalgically on the innocence of childhood. I wanted to look forward to the future. I felt like I was an adult and I wanted to be treated like one. So if I was going to be reading a book about racism, I wanted it to be much more mature and nitty-gritty. And let's be real, a lot of To Kill a Mockingbird is just full of a bunch of childish hijinks and activities that Scout and Jem are getting into. For myself, I just wasn't interested in Scout's innocent ways of looking at the world, and I just felt like a lot of the truths in this book seemed to be really simplistic. Like, it's not a very complex depiction of reality, so I just didn't connect with this book, and I found the majority of the reading experience to be pretty boring. So I don't have fond memories of To Kill a Mockingbird, and looking back on it as an older and more critical reader, I can also see that while it does teach you about racism, it really does so from a kind of white savior perspective, which maybe isn't the best way to do so. Also, when we were studying it as Canadians, we just learned about racism from like an American Southern perspective and never really turned that magnifying glass back on ourselves and how Canadian society itself has a lot of issues with racism as well. I have a few suggestions for books that I would prefer to teach instead of To Kill a Mockingbird. One of them is a book that I've just read recently, and that was If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. Now, this is a book that's going to hit a lot of the same themes, especially in regards to the American judicial system and how racism plays a role in unfairly incarcerating African Americans, and also the difficulties of fighting a wrongful conviction case. Now, I would just prefer to use this book since I think that it is told from a more mature perspective. So in this novel, the main character is 19 years old, so she's still a young adult, but she definitely has a mature and more complex way of looking at the world and is going through a growing experience in this book after her boyfriend and soon-to-be husband gets sent to jail. So this is a book that really has a lot of compelling emotional content, and James Baldwin is a stunning writer, so this is just such a great example of a flawless novel and what good prose can do. So I would love to get this book in schools. Another book that deals with similar themes is The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich. This is about a boy whose mother gets assaulted, but because it happens on a reservation, there is very little opportunity to actually pursue this crime in a legal setting. So I feel like this book is also quite critical of the judicial system and asks those questions about whether justice is fair for everybody. And since this is from an Indigenous perspective, this could be particularly relevant for Canadians reading this book. What I also like about this book is that the narrator is still a teenager, and this is a coming-of-age tale, but he is older than Scout, so his reflections are a lot more mature, and his situation is a lot more complex. And especially this is a character who considers taking justice into his own hands. So there is a lot of consequence to his actions that he has to think about, and overall I feel like this text is just more intense because the stakes are very high in this novel. So this is one that I would also really love to see in a classroom. Another book that I would just absolutely love to teach is Kindred by Octavia Octavia E. Butler, this is less about the legal system and more about racism in general, especially slavery and the violence that it can have that ring out through generations. So this is a book about a woman from the 70s who starts time traveling back to the antebellum South, where she lives as a black woman on a plantation, and of course it is a dangerous situation for her to be in. This novel is so intense. I found it to be a real page turner, and I just think that it's a great novel for students to be learning about serious subjects like slavery and racism, but also through a kind of sci-fi lens with the time travel elements going on, and in a story that is just really engaging to read in itself. Like, you just want to know what's going to happen to these characters. So this would be a book that I would just really love to teach someday. Moving along to grade 10, I got to read Lord of the Flies by William Golding. This book is kind of my nemesis. I've talked about it quite a bit on this channel since I did have to revisit it this year, since I had to teach it for the first time. And that was an interesting experience because I do not like this novel. I really don't. I did not care for it when I first read it in grade 10, and while I could appreciate more of what was going on returning to it as an adult, it's still not a text that I enjoy reading. And that was kind of my main issue with it in grade 10, is that the act of reading this book is not fun. It's kind of a confusing text. A lot of the passages are blurry. Like, William Golding is not a very compelling prose stylist, and he's not very clear a lot of the times. So I just didn't really enjoy the way that this book is constructed, and I just found it to be kind of a boring slog to get through, which I think is a bit of a problem, because if we're going to make students read novels, it shouldn't just be for the ideas that they contain, but it should also be for the craft itself, because we need to teach them that writing is an amazing vehicle for communication, and I feel like this book doesn't do that, and I really would just prefer to show the movie so that you can get to those interesting philosophical ideas and skip over the book. Maybe that's a controversial opinion, but that's just how I feel about this text. Another issue is that this book presents an overly pessimistic view of society and human nature, and this is coming from a person who considers herself to be quite a pessimist. It was even too much for me. So it goes a bit overboard, and it's not a very nuanced portrayal of its themes or ideas. It is quite over the top, banging you over the head with these kind of ideas. It's just a bit aggressive. Now, I will say, when I was in grade 10, I did quite enjoy the analytical process. I had a great teacher who really dissected this book in a compelling way, and we had quite engaging class discussions about this text. So I don't think that it's completely hopeless. It's just not a book that I would really ever reach for. So here are some of my ideas for replacements. Basically, any book that acts as a criticism of society and social norms is going to make for a good replacement of Lord of the Flies. I think that students would more easily connect with something by George Orwell. We've got 1984. Also, Animal Farm, I think, is a perfect text to use in a classroom. It's very short, but also covers a lot of ideas through this allegory. Another interesting text I would love to use would be Watchmen. Graphic novels can be an accessible way to draw in reluctant readers, but this one is also insanely complex, so there is so much to analyze in this text, and it hits on some of the same themes as Lord of the Flies and kind of addresses anxieties about atomic warfare, and also it has a more nuanced and complex version of morality and whether people are innately good or not. So this would be a really cool one to read with a class. And lastly, I think The Road by Cormac McCarthy could be an interesting replacement. I would be on the fence about teaching this one since it is just extremely bleak. This is going to turn off some readers just because of how dark and depressing it is, right? It's a post-apocalyptic tale about a father and a son, but it also does ask a lot of the same questions as Lord of the Flies. It puts people in a different situation and sees what they would be like in these circumstances where the regular rules of civilization are stripped away. So this could also be a cool text to use. Then in grade 11, I had to read The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Now this book is a little bit different than the other ones for me because I actually do quite enjoy this novel, but I really didn't enjoy the process of reading it in school and having to talk about it with other people and really tear it apart in the analysis process, because for me this book is all about kind of teen angst and feeling like you don't fit in with all the people around you and just thinking that society is crazy, and I had a pretty visceral reaction reaction to this book. Not so much an intellectual one, where I really wanted to go too much into the symbols and what does the hunting cap and the ducks in the pond mean. I just didn't really enjoy the process of studying this book, though I did like reading it. And the other thing about this book is that it is so polarizing. This is just a book that people are either going to somehow connect to Holden Caulfield a little bit, or they're going to think that he is stupid and whiny and can't stand him. So I think that this is a mistake to give this book to a class full of people, because you just know that there are going to be a lot of people in the room who are not going to appreciate what this novel has to offer. For me, Catcher in the Rye represents themes of teen angst and mental health issues and feelings of alienation and not connecting to the society and the people around you. So there are really a lot of books that could fit that bill. First of all, if you wanted to stick with Salinger, I think Franny and Zooey might be a more compelling novel, because if you hate Zoe Glass, then at least you got Franny and some other characters to fall back on, and I think it just explores a wider range of ideas and what it means to be a kind, compassionate person in this book, and it's kind of just a bit less overt than Catcher in the Rye is. Another cool text that takes on teen angst is Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. This, again, is a graphic novel about a teenage girl who is living in Iran following the revolution. So what's really cool about this one is that she is still like an angsty teenager dealing with that difficult time of her life, but it's also connected to these larger social factors. So she is dealing with a society that has new political values and norms, and she's really uncomfortable with those and rebelling against them. So it has that personal aspect, but it also kind of has this political, societal aspect as well. It's also really funny and quite a charming read, so I could just see more students being able to enjoy this one than the more polarizing Catcher. Another classic that I think would be a good fit is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This is also dealing with those feelings of isolation, and it's largely about struggles with mental health, especially the difficulties of depression. And one of the best things about this book is the way that Sylvia Plath uses imagery. Since she is coming from a poetic background, there are just so many beautiful images in this book, metaphors. It would be a great one to unpack and analyze together. Another book that I think would be another cool one to try out would be We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. Again, this one's just kind of short, really different, unreliable narrator situation going on, and the narrator of this book, Mary Cat, is a teen who really does not fit in with her society. Her family is often ostracized by the small town villagers, so she is also quite critical of the world around her and feeling like she doesn't belong in it. The last novel that I read while I was in high school was The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, and you have to understand where I'm coming from for this one. I felt like, this was grade 12, this was our final year of English class. I was really ready to tackle something difficult and demanding, or a classic. I wanted something meaty for grade 12. And instead we got The Kite Runner, which I would kind of more classify as popular fiction, more of like a bestseller, a kind of Oprah's pick, like that your mom would be reading in a book club kind of book. Not saying there's anything wrong with that, but just not what I was looking for as a 17-year-old reader. Basically, The Kite Runner disappointed me on almost every front. The writing was not very sensational, and the story was sort of predictable and not that compelling, and the themes were just very obvious, and the big thing about the book is all about like forgiveness and moving on from the wrongs of the past, which again is like not a great book to throw at teenagers, because you don't really often have that same dark relationship with your past. Like, I don't know, I just found that that was not something that I could really connect to. So The Kite Runner did not work for me. And it's also interesting that about 10 years later, I can hardly remember anything about this book. It really didn't leave much of an impression on me, and it just seemed pretty forgettable. Now, the one thing that The Kite Runner had going for it is that it's the most diverse book that I read in high school, in that it's set in a different part of the world, so I got to learn a little bit about the Middle East. So my replacement for The Kite Runner would be A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mystery. Now, this This is a great book because it's written by a Canadian author, so it would check that box, but it's also set in an international setting, so it still is like a really diverse novel. This book is set in the 70s when India declared a state of internal emergency, and it largely deals with the extreme poverty that people were dealing with at that time, and that continues to be an issue in the present day as well. So it takes these kind of 4 separate characters, connects their lives, and just tells their stories. So this is just a beautiful piece of storytelling. It's a well-crafted novel, and it's just such a successful piece of fiction, and it's also just so incredibly emotionally powerful. So I feel like this book takes you to that emotionally cathartic place that the Kite Runner attempted to get to, but just didn't work for me at all, whereas this is just a devastating read, and I think it's one that is hard-hitting and will stay with you for the rest of your life, so that's why it could be a really cool book to tackle as a 12th grader. So that's it for my list of the books that I read in high school and some other books that I thought might have made for some more fitting replacements. Of course, this is all just my personal opinion. I, of course, have my own sense of taste when it comes to books, and I'm sure everyone else has different views out there. I would love to hear if you have any ideas on these books, if you have some different ones you'd like to add, or if you did enjoy these required reading books that I didn't and you have a different take on them. I think it's an interesting conversation to have. When it comes down to it, I think part of the reason why so many of us don't like required reading in high school is that we didn't really have a choice in the matter, and there's just not going to be any single book that is going to please a classroom full of 20 to 30 individuals. So that's something that we're seeing in education, is kind of moving away from that idea of a one-size-fits-all novel study, and a lot of English classrooms are moving forward using this model called lit circles, where basically the teacher gives you a few options of books that you can be reading with a group of people, so you still get that discussion element, but it's more student-directed, and you get some choice in the matter. Because let's face it, teenagers are inherently rebellious. I know that I felt that way, right? If you're given something and told to like it, it's just usually not going to work out that way. You're kind of going to be in critical mode, trying to find faults with it, to not like the status quo. So when you're giving students some more options, the hope is that maybe they'll feel a little bit more invested in the book since it was their own choice and it wasn't like you have to read this or else. There's a lot of merit to giving students choice, especially for trying to foster an enjoyment for reading, since when you're an adult and you leave school, no one's telling you to read anything, and you kind of have to find those books on your own and read them because you want to, because you're gaining something from it, and sometimes even it can be a fun time. So that's a pretty good model, and I'm excited to see that in play going forward. But there is something that is kind of lost when you do throw out the whole one-size-fits-all class novel, and that is just having that full class discussion. And there's something really special about a large group of people reading the same book and having such different interpretations of it, different reactions to it. There's something that's really rich about that experience of everyone going through it together. So you do lose that sense of the whole class as a community feeling when you're doing the lit circle approach, but I do think that the benefits of choice maybe outweigh that loss of that experience. But it still is kind of a new idea, and it remains to be seen how that's going to play out in the future. So I'm going to put an end to my long-winded thoughts on high school required reading. I'm sorry that this video is so long, but I'm just clearly quite passionate about this topic, and that's why I would love to continue this conversation down in the comments below, because I would just love to know, what books were you required to read? Did you like them? Did you not? What did you like about the experience? What would you have liked to have seen done differently? What do you think I should do as an educator? If you have any advice for me, I would really love to hear anything like that, so please feel free to drop me a line down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you again some other day. Bye!